With the rise of violent fascism across the United States, there's also a response of anti-fascists who are also willing to take up arms and diligently protect people who are the targets of fascists across the country. I'm Jessica Burbank, this is The Conversation. And today to talk about this, we have Natasha Lennard, who's a columnist with the Intercept and a professor at the New School for Social Research in New York. She wrote a book, Being Numerous Essays on Non-Fascist Life. Natasha, tell us how you got into this work.
Gosh, it's well, first of all, thank you for having me, Jessica. It's really nice to be here digitally. So yeah, I've been looking at the rise of fascist constellations long before the so-called fascism debate arose around Trump's ascendancy, relying on long histories of movement politics around anti-fascist street resistance in the United States and in Europe, some of which dates back to specifically what is known as like Antifa, which is quite a European constellation of physical, combative street and occasionally armed resistance, but also the history of Black radical community self-defense in the United States, particularly. So these are kind of histories I've written about for the last decade or so, and have been paying more and more attention to. The more and more, unfortunately, it seems that we need to have these kind of constellations in the streets today.
And what was your exact introduction into this work? Were you someone who was participating in movement politics? What's the story there?
I'm a journalist and a writer. I got involved in New York City in the Occupy movement, which definitely didn't define itself. So that was 2011. Never defined itself specifically as anti-fascist. It was far more legible and articulated as an anti-capitalist movement. But I'm very much in agreement with the writing and thinking around a kind of robust anti-capitalism that understands the risk of fascist constellations, fascist movements coming out of various forms of modernity and capitalism. So it's not like I got into movement politics through what was known as anti-fascism, but I think as everyone who's being paid attention to the rise of the far right in the last 10 years, and the kind of leftist responses, it's not that unusual that people that were involved in Occupy Wall Street and then understanding the need for a kind of strong anti-racist response to both the carceral state, policing, prisons, politics as normal, and naming that as a kind of anti-fascist set of things as well. So anti-capitalism with anti-racism should lead one to quite comfortably taking up anti-fascist action.
Right. Your work is so incredibly important because we're at this interesting place in the United States where this group, Antifa, has kind of been slandered as this extremist group that's violent. But your work in covering anti-fascist action in the United States tells a bit of a different story, that they're trying to prevent fascist violence. Can you tell us more about that?
So sure, and I would, want to make the clarification that there is no Antifa group, right? It's a tactic. So I would say there's a lot of anti-fascist action that doesn't use the label or the umbrella term of Antifa. That's a specific set of openly militant, willing to take on Nazis and different types of fascism, white supremacists in the street under the broad label Antifa. But I would say, if you think about the sort of radical activism around the uprisings of 2020 or the uprisings in Ferguson against, the violence of policing, I would call that anti-fascist, even if it was certainly not anything that would self-describe as Antifa. But I think obviously at that same time, and even before that, and ever more so, Antifa has become a really convenient boogeyman for Republicans particularly, but also, centrist and mainstream Democrats to talk about that, old canard of, well, of course, we've got a major problem of far-right white supremacist extremism, violent armed extremism, murderous, deadly extremism. So there seems to be this compulsion both in Congress and throughout the mainstream media to be like, well, there must be the left-wing equivalent. Who is that? It's Antifa. And this two-sidesism has played out very much by calling into being this violent threat of Antifa or anti-fascism more generally, which is of course absurd. But I think specifically the way I try to explain these kind of tensions and explain why that sort of two-sidesism is so inappropriate and so misplaced and actually so dangerous is because even if you're talking about anti-fascist groups that do take up arms or would be willing to, physically confront far-right groups in the street, or as I've written about recently, the sort of groups that have been willing to arm themselves to provide security for queer events or drag brunches that are being really, really violently and aggressively threatened and attacked by far-right groups. These are not escalatory forces, they are de-escalatory. So it's with the understanding that the far right has made clear that they have eliminationist desires, that they want to do away with trans communities, that they will do everything they can to make trans lives unlivable in this moment, with arms, with threats, with, extra legal and now legalized violence in a lot of states. So groups saying, we too will stand by just to protect these communities, to protect their own communities in the long history of radical community defense does not mean that like people coming in defensive modes to these spaces with guns are escalating a violence that really eliminationist violence can't be escalated, right? It's total in its desires. So I think that's the danger of the two-sidesism that we see in a lot of mainstream media.
Right, absolutely. When we think about things like the Club Q shooting or this planned attack on a drag brunch in Texas, these are commonplace now in the United States. These attempts to disrupt, violently so, these drag events. And it's coming from the perspective of not wanting these people to live their life as they see fit. It's infringing upon their freedoms and their basic human rights to say that we don't want you to exist and we're going to disrupt this. And so I really appreciate you pointing out this false narrative of the two-sidesism of anti-fascist action. Can you say more about things escalating in the United States with fascists taking more action and what we can expect to see in the future and what trends you're noticing?
So I would say it's part of a long, since the birth of this nation, if not in the DNA of this very nation state, part of this consistent backlash of white supremacist claims to white standing that has always been historically violent, from the elimination of indigenous people, from the incredible violent backlash after post-Reconstruction, to the very, very kind of far right Christian nationalist turns after the civil rights movement last century. I think we're seeing another iteration of that. So I don't think it's new, but I think it's a very violent latest iteration of white supremacist backlash that will take a violent turn both within the law. So we've seen these really awful laws passed in state after state, hundreds and hundreds of bills passing in the last 2 years at pace through state houses, through Republican state houses, to basically illegalize and criminalize trans life, let alone reproductive freedoms for pregnant people, and voting rights for people of color. It all comes together, and I think it would we do ourselves and liberation struggles in general no favors if we try and separate them. So I think at the same time, and this has also happened throughout history, you have these legalized forms of persecution being formalized. It comes together with militia violence. So it's violent legal forces and then illegal violence working together. And I think we've just seen that escalate in the last 2 years, particularly with trans children and trans communities being the most scapegoated, I would say, in at least that discourse because it's so easy to point to this notion of the imperiled child to activate right-wing forces.
Right. I mean, I would say in many ways in the United States, so many people are desensitized to the structures that we have in place that many would label as fascist. What do you think it takes for people? I know as a journalist, sometimes you'll get messages like, the way you've put this really made sense to me and it made me get it. To really get people to call a spade and say that we're living in a country that is fascist, the way the police handle themselves in many occasions and the structures that we have of white supremacy. How do we get that message across?
I mean, it's tricky when you have institutions like the trusted paper of record, the New York Times, very much playing into a sort of two-sidesism, like, but the Proud Boys say this, and then the trans people whose lives they're threatening say this. Both have good points. It's a difficult place to intervene in. But I would say anyone, it sounds like such a banal point, but read the history. And I would say it's not unique to the United States. I think we're seeing these kind of constellations and assemblages of militant fascism aligned with a centralized politics of far-right parties gaining power throughout Europe as well and beyond. So I don't think it's exceptional to America, but I think if you need to look at the history of American white backlash, it can inform at least an understanding of why a robust anti-fascist response is necessary.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your perspective and everything you've shared. If people want to read more of your work and follow your work, where should they find you?
They could either find me at Natasha Lennard on Twitter, and my column is at The Intercept, so it's theintercept.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with us today, Natasha.
Thanks, Jessica.